Hi, and welcome to the Becoming Trauma-Informed podcast, where we help you understand how your past painful experiences are affecting your current reality and how you can shift those so you can create your desired future. I'm Dr. Lee, and both myself and our team at the Institute for Trauma and Psychological Safety are excited to support you on your journey. We talk about all the things on this podcast. No topic gets left uncovered. So, extending a content warning to you before we get started. If you notice yourself getting activated while listening, invitation to take care of yourself and to pause, skip ahead a bit, or just check out another episode. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. I am honored and blessed to have two of our fabulous ITPS team members here with me today in the studio. I have Dr. Lindsey Luther, who also may be my sister, who is our fabulous programming consultant. She helps us figure out what we're going to teach y'all at the Institute. And Dr. Nicole Garritano, who is one of our fabulous core instructors. And today we are going to be talking about why healthcare providers are leaving the bedside. And we're going to look at this from a trauma-informed perspective. And the three of us are all nurse practitioners. And so I wanted to have Dr. Lindsey and Dr. Nicole on because I think that we all have some similar yet different stories of how we've ended up where we are in our careers. And we all have a good amount of experience in leadership. So I really just wanted to have them come on. We're going to just have a casual chat about what we've seen, why we think from an institute perspective, people are leaving the bedside, people are choosing to not be in clinical practice anymore, and just talk about some of the things that we think can hopefully change this. So, Dr. Lindsey, do you want to just introduce yourself, tell everybody a little bit about what you're doing in your current career?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So I'm Dr. Lindsey Luther. I'm a family nurse practitioner in the Columbus, Ohio area, and I have been a nurse practitioner now for 9 years. I was actually a graduate entry nurse practitioner, which means probably nothing to a lot of people, but my background was not in nursing. So I came to nursing as a second degree program. And because of that, I actually did not have a lot of bedside nursing experience. Most of my nursing experience was in the outpatient setting, internal medicine, family practice kind of setting. And so that was a different perspective coming into nursing because I didn't have the years at the bedside seeing how that works. And then throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to work now in a hospital-based outpatient department for almost 9 years. I also worked a little bit on an inpatient rotation, doing admissions in the emergency room and rounding on stable patients in the hospital. And then I also work now in an outpatient obesity medicine practice. Throughout all of that, I always loved my clinical practice, but I kind of knew that teaching was my passion. And so a few years ago, I started working full-time as a family nurse practitioner faculty member at a small nursing college. And then from there, I've actually moved on to now working for an education company that serves nurse practitioners across the country. So for me, the experience of burnout, frustration with clinical practice, it's a lot of things. The places that I have seen it the most in my career, one are with just feeling like you have lost the ability to have an impact. And that is what has led me to change careers several times or to change the focus of my practice. Because at some point you realize that there are just more constraints than will ever allow you to do things the way that you want to do them in your practice. And with teaching, especially during the pandemic, I felt so emotionally distressed by the distress that I was seeing in my students. They were all practicing nurses who were working at the bedside and completing their degrees. And it became emotionally burdensome and difficult for me to witness all the things that they were going through and also have a clinical practice and teach the way that I loved. So that sort of led me out of my day-to-day clinical practice. And I'm fortunate that I get to stick around with my patients for a few hours a week, which feels right now like a great balance for me.
I'm hearing so much in that. I think the biggest thing that stands out to me is is something that I think is a reason that a lot of nurses and healthcare providers in general leave the bedside, which is secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, which is I'm hearing all of these stories, I'm seeing all of these things, and while the bad, scary things or the painful things aren't happening to me, they're happening to people that then I'm taking care of, or I'm in charge of mentoring, or I'm in charge of teaching. And that is a heavy burden to bear, especially if you don't then have any of your own resources to be able to, dump that out or vent that out or work it out somewhere else. So I think a lot of people, myself included, will resonate with that piece of it, because it's I think very prevalent in today's healthcare world. Dr. Nicole, we'd love to hear from you too.
Yeah, so I'm similar to Dr. Lindsey. Nursing was a second career for me, although I did work at the bedside and then went back to become a nurse practitioner. So I'm in the pediatric realm though. So I worked some in the NICU and some in the PACU as a bedside nurse. Then I went back, became a nurse practitioner, and had experience in the PICU, heart failure transplant, and then urgent care and retail clinic for kids. Now, while I was in my DNP program, I got recruited over into academia, so we have similar paths, and I went over to that side and still worked PRN. For me, I was in like the business world for 8 years before I ever went into healthcare. So I was in this unique position as a new bedside nurse, being a little bit older, and the fact that I actually understood it was a giant corporation, right, at the end of the day. So I did know what was going on behind the scenes, but I could feel the frustration in my colleagues who didn't really understand that. So right away off the bat, I always felt like in healthcare, many providers, it's a disservice because they're not taught the business piece of it, even on a small scale while they're in school to become a provider. So they really miss out on learning that organizational piece, and they have to learn it like boots on the ground through going to meetings and oftentimes feeling very victimized, right, in their roles without truly understanding all the processes in place. So I was always grateful that I had this business background and could see it, right, from a different type of lens. However, I am here to say I got burnout in my clinical role. I experienced burnout in my academic role, very similar to Dr. Lindsey. I saw students just suffering, burning it, at both ends, trying to work full time, trying to pursue these degrees. And then even internally, when we think about the structures we're working in, whether it's the healthcare system or academia, where there's also this like sense of competition, and we're not always supporting each other in the ways that maybe in our heart we want to, but the mentality gets to be one where, oh, if I don't achieve this, then I don't get the promotion, then I don't get the raise, then this person gets it, or I need to sign up for this shared governance, I need to be part of this. And we end up in this very dysregulated system within our body because we're just grasping and trying and pushing. And at the end of the day, we all got into healthcare because we have a heart for caring for other people. We really want to see people heal. I mean, I want to see those kids, right, get the new heart when I worked in that environment. I wanted to see them come in for follow-up. And I really didn't want to go to all the meetings, right, and deal with some of the behind the scenes. And yet that's a very real part of the role that I always felt we weren't truly preparing people for. So one of the things, I always like to look at things through a new lens, as you both know from being around me. So when I was in academia, still full-time, I really tried to build some of that into my curriculum to give my students a taste of it so that when they did get out there in those expanded roles and were doing new things, or even in the moment while they were sitting in meetings, they started thinking about things in a new way. And that helped them cope a little bit better with the circumstances they were often placed in. And also very similar to Dr. Lindsey, when I was still teaching during the pandemic, and the students just like changed overnight. I mean, there was like nothing you could do to help them at the level you wanted to help them at. And so many times I felt like the punching bag that was just available, right? Like the easy person to send the scathing emails to, because they had nowhere else to go with all their frustration and the internal turmoil, you know what I mean, that they were in. And so it was actually the pandemic that pushed me out of my PRN role, out of my academic role and full-time into my business, coaching and facilitating. So that's a little bit about my background.
I love this. I don't think I realized how much all three of us had in common. I mean, Lindsey I knew because, hello, we are sisters, but I just resonate so much with that feeling of helplessness from the student perspective. And that is a big thing when we talk about trauma. One of the most common places that people will experience trauma or store trauma in their bodies is when something scary or dangerous is happening, aka a pandemic. There's a lot of change, there's a lot of uncertainty, and when we feel helpless, that puts us into states of what we refer to as freeze or fight, where our bodies are just, they don't know what to do. They literally don't know what to do. And so they get stuck and they stay still. And other people, like you were mentioning, sometimes will be in other responses to that threat, like fight, where they're going to get passive aggressive or they're going to get angry. They're going to send the scathing email. And so I think you're highlighting so much of the fact that the pandemic created a lot of trauma responses, a lot of fear and a lot of threat response in us, both individually and as a whole, from a healthcare provider and from a student, a learner perspective.
So, you hear a lot about how the pandemic has pushed our healthcare system over the edge. And I think that is true. And I also don't think that the average person knows just how close we were to the edge before the pandemic started. And I think a lot of that is in what Nicole was saying. Healthcare systems are incredibly complex. And most of the public discourse that you hear about health insurance, about financing for healthcare, about, Medicare for all, most of those conversations don't get to the level of nuance that they need to get to in order to provide solutions, which, again, as Dr. Nicole was saying, is not something I understood when I got my master's degree, even in nursing. It wasn't until I was getting that business training, getting that systems level training in my doctorate, that I really understood all the things that go into this. But more than that, I think talking about helplessness, the system was already close to its breaking point in terms of staffing, in terms of finances, in terms of resources available. And that is both the healthcare system and the education system. And then we added in this incredible amount of stress from the pandemic. We talked about our healthcare providers as the heroes that were going to save us. And yet those healthcare providers really didn't have what they needed to do that effectively. And that created even more of a sense of helplessness on the front lines, in the ER, in the hospital, even in the outcare patient primary care world. We didn't have what we needed to do what we needed to do effectively. And so for a lot of us, that created just this sense of helplessness. And I think there's a lot of anger. And I think that is a lot of what's leading our nurses away from their clinical practice, and not just nurses, but healthcare providers as a whole.
I got chills as I was listening to you say that. And before we go into this even further too, one of the things I want to say is this, and I think that you're highlighting this really beautifully here, Dr. Lindsey, is this is a systemic issue. So a lot of people are looking at the CFOs, the C-suite execs, and going, why are you all doing this? I remember being a nurse before I got my doctoral training, and again, got put into some of those meetings and hearing some of those conversations. And while I think that there are many cases in which the people in leadership positions truly don't understand what is happening at the granular level, at that bedside level, I also know and watched those humans and how much they cared and how stressed they were. And I think that there's a lot of times we put the onus, the responsibility of fixing the things on the people in those leadership positions, not recognizing that they are also operating in systems that tie their hands together. And that, if they have to answer to a board that says, why did we only make $4 million last year instead of $24 million? There's so many pieces and parts that go into that. So I just really want to say that if there's anyone in leadership listening, I know a lot of times we vilify the people who are in charge. And I want to have a conversation at an even higher level around how do we actually think about creating systems that serve and support everyone in them, including leadership and including people who are there at the bedside and at the more frontline level.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I completely agree. I feel like people in those leadership positions were already stressed out too, right? And everyone brings their own trauma, as we know in this circle and in the work that we do. So they're just as traumatized, and because they probably started, most of them or some of them, in healthcare provider or bedside type of roles, they have the lived trauma of those experiences all the way up the food chain to their leadership positions that they have now. And I feel like sometimes until all of us have had a chance to step away, right, in some way and evaluate through a different lens. And that is so different than people potentially listening that are in it every single day, trying to make their way. But even being able to take that breath and step back and think about sometimes leadership as like the human being that they are, like what experience have they had? Where have they been? You don't even know all the intricacies of everyone's personal lives, which impacts, our work lives as well. And so I feel like the shift, like we love to look at our patients in a holistic way, right? And through this lens, why are we not looking at each other that way? And I agree with you. It's because of the systems in place. We haven't been allowed or even invited, right, to do that.
Yeah. Oof. This makes me think about something that I know we wanted to touch on, which is two of the main places that I see issues from a systemic perspective and also from a top-down perspective, like leadership to communicating to the front lines, communicating to the bedside, is a lack of feeling safe within the organization, both at the leadership level and below, which if y'all have been in my space or our space for a while, I don't really like words like above and below, and we are kind of talking about a hierarchical system here, so there's not really a way around that. So the lack of safety, both psychologically and physically, and then also the lack of, or pieces and parts missing of, holistic trust. And so I want to start with the psychological safety piece first and the physical safety piece first. And I wanted to share a story, and I'm curious if y'all have had an experience like this too, because I feel like most healthcare providers that I talk to, especially nurses, have had this kind of experience. But I remember being in one of the executive meetings that I was in as a DNP, and I'll keep all this as general as I can here. But we were having a conversation around why nurses weren't reporting abuse, why nurses weren't reporting physical violence from patients. And I remember one of the executives saying, well, we just need to encourage the managers to have people report this, right? Like we just need to let them know that they're safe to report this. And I must have had a look on my face, because my preceptor, who was one of these executives, looked at me and said, Lee, you work here, you're at the bedside. What do you think about this? And I was like, no. Like, I don't really want to share my opinion. All of you are my boss. No, thank you. Right. Which is another thing. Do I feel safe? Do I feel psychologically safe taking a risk and telling this story to everyone? Right. But she kind of continued to prod me on, and I trusted her. And I said, when I was pregnant with my twins, I was probably 20 or 24 weeks pregnant. I was working in the medical ICU, and I had a patient who was delirious and psychotic, and he kicked me in the stomach so hard that I hit the wall behind me. And I came out of the room like very, very upset. I was angry, and obviously in a threat response, because, baby's in danger. And I told my charge nurse, I was like, I'm not going back in that room. Like, I need somebody else to take this assignment. And I remember the response was basically like, nope, we're not switching this around. You need to go back in there. You need to just stay away from it. You need to figure out another way. And I'm like, how am I supposed to provide care to somebody that I can't even get physically close to without endangering my own life or my kids' lives? And I remember the next day, like from that point forward, I remember that I was kind of labeled one of the quote unquote difficult nurses, because I had a boundary around the fact that I wasn't going to take care of patients in a way that endangered my own health. And so I told them that story, and they were like, that happens? And I said, all the time. And so I think that there's this disconnect, one of us feeling comfortable enough to, psychologically safe enough to go to our leadership and say, hey, this doesn't feel good. Hey, this is dangerous. Hey, I don't think this is right. Some other examples here are like nurse staffing ratios or overtime. Like, I've worked 17 hours. I don't think it's safe for me to stay here any longer. I think that that's one piece. And then also just the physical safety, the physicality of this. I mean, healthcare providers are one of the most abused populations in their work in the world.
Yeah. And well, what's kind of coming up for me as I'm even listening to you say that, and I feel like it's important for anyone listening too, is that like that whole idea of like people don't want to report. If people really look back in their upbringing, when they were a child at some point, they were probably told like, don't be the tattletale, or like you brought up, you got labeled then kind of like the problem employee because you know what I mean, said, I don't want to go back in that room. Well, how many times does that happen to us as children in school when we speak up, right? A teacher then kind of gives us a label. And so we bring these labels, right, into the next phase. And it's just fascinating to reflect back because we know we're all bringing this conditioning and this learned behavior into our workplace. However, we've each had a different experience with that. So even like the physical abuse piece, you know, how many healthcare providers were maybe not treated well as children or bullied at some point in school where it becomes acceptable, right? Somewhere in their mind, it has become acceptable that, okay, I guess I get treated this way sometimes by certain people and I'm resilient, so I just deal with it, right? We start to become these archetypes as well in this process. And I just bring that up so listeners can start to see like just how layered this really is. And that's why I love the work we do, because so many times in healthcare with healthcare providers, it's just like a Band-Aid. We're trying to put a Band-Aid on things, right? Like, we'll give you a pizza day. We'll go have a break, meditate, go outside, you know, we'll change your hours up a little bit, but we're not looking at, we're all very layered, complex individuals, and we're never really looking at that. So I feel like it's really important to stress that here for maybe people hearing this for the first time that are healthcare providers. So they start to really see themselves as like this beautiful layered human being that brings lots of different experiences, not just education and multiple degrees to their role every day.
I've been really fortunate to have very few patient aggressive situations. There are some, and most of them were because that person was not cognitively able to, you know, control their own behavior. Which is funny that I just used that wording, because what I was going to say after that is that most of my really traumatic experiences have been with incivility with colleagues. And I think we talk to nurses, we talk to physicians about civility and healthcare providers about civility. And we act like all we have to do is teach them the appropriate way to talk to people and then they'll be fine. But the same thing happens to our providers in times of extreme stress as happens to our patients in times of extreme stress. They lose cognitive control. Their brains are not doing the thinking. It's it's not the thinking part of their brain that's making decisions for them. So I worked outpatient surgery for a lot of years, and I would see patients who were coming from home. Many of them were under-resourced because of where we worked. A lot of times transportation was an issue, so they would get to the hospital very quickly before their surgery. And my job was to do a full evaluation and make sure that it was safe to do their surgery, which you want to have if you're the one having surgery. But I also know from that complexity standpoint that every minute in the OR that there's no patient being operated on, every minute that's wasted costs thousands and thousands of dollars. Every surgery that's canceled costs thousands and thousands of dollars, not just in the time for the people, but the time for the room, the equipment, all of the cleaning, all the things that have to go into it behind the scenes. And so there is this incredible time pressure all the time. And every minute, literally, we would count the minutes that were wasted. Every minute had to be attributed to a different human being. So if it was
What?
Yeah. So we would attribute, well, the surgeon was 8 minutes late. Anesthesia held up the patient for 4 minutes. The transporting nurse was delayed. I mean, it was literally minute by minute. And so we would calculate, there was a calculation for where this lost productivity, AKA money, was going. And so you can imagine that system creating incredible stress and also creating unsafe momentum, because if there's something that warrants further investigation, it takes time to do that. And so most of the conflicts that I had were with disagreement between whether or not something was safe and whether we could move forward or if we needed more time to work it out. And that is a really scary place to be as a provider, because you're ultimately responsible for whatever decision gets made and you're responsible for that time. So, you feel this incredible pull both ways. And obviously we all want what's best for our patients. That's so important, but it's not the metric that is used to evaluate us. That is not our metric. So that for me was the place where I really struggled, and where I have seen human beings who are otherwise brilliant, capable, obviously calm under pressure. It takes a lot of cool to be able to cut a human body open and fix it on the inside. Yeah. And there have been moments where I've seen people who have that ability not be able to regulate themselves in stressful situations, because it is a skill that we don't put enough emphasis into developing in our providers.
You're talking about emotional and physical regulation, which if you're listening to this episode and you don't know what those are, welcome. That is such a common thing. I didn't learn about emotional and physical regulation until the last year of my doctoral program. It's why we started the Institute, because I went, holy cow, everybody needs to know what this is. So when we say emotional regulation, we're talking about being able to be in command of how you are showing up in a situation and how to be able to respond instead of react. And I think that this is something that also is so important to talk about, because there are so many pieces and parts of how we currently have our healthcare system set up, especially in clinical practice, but also in research, also in some other places, that are dysregulating. So like Dr. Lindsey just talked about, I'm going to have minutes assigned to me and be responsible for all of this lost money. Or when I write this note, if I don't put in specific diagnoses, even if I don't feel like these are things that my patients necessarily, I want to label them with, or I want to be in their chart, but if I don't put these in, then I can't bill at a higher level. And so the hospital loses money. Or if I take 27 minutes to do an H&P, a history and physical, and my colleague takes 16, then they're able to see more patients. So they sometimes have a higher RVU. So they then get paid more. There's all of these pieces and parts that create a lot of scarcity, that create a lot of, like Dr. Lindsey said, pressure, that create a lot of dysregulation, meaning we feel activated in our bodies. We feel a sense of threat, whether that's the loss of money or the potential reprimand from our supervisor or the potential harm caused to a patient. And so honestly, I would say being at the bedside as a clinician, being in the military, doing active duty, and being a first responder. Those are the three places that I don't think I've ever seen as much dysregulation in my life. I think that those are the three key places. And so when we talk about the need for psychological safety and the need for physical safety, what that means is can we start to look at how we are setting up the system and create more spaces where people are able to be regulated? Can we look at the policies and procedures that we have in place and look at, wow, this actually creates a lot of dysregulation in people because it causes them to compete or it causes them to hurry, or it causes them to question themselves. So I don't know what y'all's thoughts are on that, but
I just want to add to one of the things that I think makes healthcare so dysregulating is this model we've created where we look at our healthcare providers as heroes and sacrificers instead of as human beings who need to eat, who need to pee, who need to sleep at night. Like I can't tell you how many of my colleagues had already been awake for 16 hours when they got to work that day because they had another shift that had backed up, or they had a problem with their child, or anybody who had just worked a 24-hour call shift and now was doing a post-call day with 8 hours in the hospital. Nurses who don't get to go to the bathroom from 4 a.m. until they leave at 2 p.m. because that's how busy their shift is. You can't expect people who are not eating, sleeping, or taking care of their bodily functions to regulate their emotions successfully 100% of the time.
Thank you for pointing that out, because there is actual research that, you know how we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which a lot of us learn in our healthcare education. Those physical needs are necessary, like you just said, for us to be able to meet our emotional needs and our psychological needs. And so if we are hungry, tired, thirsty, any of those physical, in pain is a huge one. If we are any of those physical things, you're right, our capacity to then regulate, our capacity to stay calm and to respond instead of react goes completely out the window. So I think that you're right. As somebody who used to work 19-hour shifts, which sometimes turned into 20-hour shifts, which I tell people that these days, and they're like, how? I said, I don't think people even understand how exhausting the healthcare system can be for practitioners. I have a client who is a physician, and when we were first talking, they were telling me about how many hours on average they work because they're now attending, or they weren't attending. They weren't a resident anymore. We have caps on how much residents work. And that got put into place. I'd have to go back actually to watch Grey's Anatomy, because I remember that they taught that. Yeah, like, I don't know, 5-10 years. My physician friends, please let me know. But I remember that episode on Grey's Anatomy when they put that 80-hour cap in on the students, on the people who were learning how to do surgery. And they were mad because they were like, I'm not going to learn what I need to learn. And everyone else is working 100 and 110 hours and I can't get what I need. And even the nursing, we had a cap, I think, at 60 hours or 68 hours. But still, that is 20 to 30 hours over what we should be ideally working as humans. And that doesn't count the people who worked 60 hours at one institution and then went to another institution to get around that rule and worked overtime there. So some people were going even above and beyond that.
Well, it's bringing up for me, when you're saying people ask you, because I remember working nights and being on a rotating shift where I did like 3 at night, 3 nights, 3 days. It was terrible for your system. Yes. I remember on heart failure transplant, I would work like a 12-hour day. I'd be the one with the pager. It would go off right as I'm pulling in my driveway, which meant I had to go back because there was a heart, which that's a joyous celebration. And sometimes by the time I got home the next day, I'd been up over 20 something hours. You know what I mean? And people used to say, just like you were saying, they ask you, how did you do it? Don't you feel like we disassociate? And so many healthcare providers do in those moments disassociate from what we're actually doing to our physical bodies by staying up.
That's a really great point, because for anyone not familiar with dissociation or disassociation, they're the same thing. It's like, I always loved if you wrote alert and oriented versus alert and orientated. I always saw people write alert and orientated and I'm like, that's not right. And then I'm like, no, you can actually do it either way. So dissociate or disassociate. Either way. If you're not familiar with dissociation, that's where we literally check out of our bodies, where we stop feeling what we are feeling and our mind goes somewhere else because it's too painful or too uncomfortable or too activating to stay here in our own physical bodies. And you're absolutely right. I think most people in the healthcare system, we are actively, while it's not outwardly stated, it is very strongly implicitly taught that you come after your work. that your body's needs and your mind's needs come after everything else is taken care of, like Dr. Lindsey was saying. And I remember having to pee for like 3 hours. I had colleagues that would get urinary tract infections and kidney stones. I had colleagues that ended up with type 2 diabetes because their insulin levels were all over the place from their sleep schedule being off and the food that they were eating and just the stress. Like there were so many. And myself, I was a wreck for about 4 months after I left clinical practice. I remember waking up one morning and being like, oh, this is what it feels like to be rested after 10 years of not even experiencing that.
Yeah, and like not being able to show your emotions, right? Don't show any emotion in front of a patient.
Yes.
Don't act like you care too much.
Yeah.
Right? You can't cry or
Yes,
get teary-eyed.
Right? Like being taught, don't show more emotion than your patient does. And it's like, but what if my patient needs me to show emotion so that they feel safe showing emotion?
So I'm thinking a lot about resilience. So you always hear like, oh, but healthcare providers are resilient. Students are resilient. Nurses are resilient. Like, yes, we are all resilient. And, one thing, there were a lot of things about the job that I was talking about in surgery that were not excellent. But the one thing that was like exceptional is I worked with the best group of human beings I've ever worked with in my entire life. And that kept me at that job for almost a decade. I love those humans to this day. I would do anything for any of them. And often it felt like we were doing more than we should have been doing because we were doing it for each other, to help each other out and to help our patients. One place that I feel like COVID has really damaged our healthcare system is in the loss of continuity of work teams in the healthcare setting. We've lost our friends that we used to love working with because what has happened is that there's just been this cascade of burnout where somebody gets burned out and they leave. And that person was the one thing holding this other person there. And so that person leaves, and then the next person leaves, and the next person leaves. As a provider, the reason that I left my hospital system, despite loving this job for a long time, ultimately was because I went to work a few months ago and I looked around at the staff in the unit that I had been working in for 9 years, and I only recognized like 2 faces. And I thought, how did this happen? And it's scary as the person who relies on those eyes and ears on the floor to be making decisions when you don't know the people who are backing you up on those decisions. And so that for me was a turning point where I felt like I didn't feel safe doing what I needed to do in that role anymore.
You're bringing this back to the safety piece, which I think is so helpful. And you're actually helping me realize a piece of my story that I didn't even know was there, because so I was the on-call provider nocturnally, and I worked mostly Sundays because I also taught in academia. And so I would go in Sunday at noon and I would leave Monday morning at 7:30 a.m. And I remember we had such high turnover. We're in bone marrow transplant. And when I started on bone marrow transplant, most of the nurses had been there for at least 15 years. I mean, we had very few newbies. That was the unit that you went to and you stayed. And they were, it was just, there was so much continuity. And I remember my last 2 months, I would get pages and I would see these names and I'd say, I don't know who this nurse is. Or I'd go walk the floor, and I was only working once a week. And so I wasn't there as much as I used to be. I used to be there 3 to 4 days a week. And I'd walk the floor and I wouldn't know if this was a nurse where if they paged me, I needed to come running, or if this was a nurse where if they paged me, a lot of times they're a little bit more sensitive to some things. And so there's somebody who needed a little bit more of guidance and reassurance around how their patient was doing. So as a provider, it became even harder to do my job because I didn't know the humans that I was working with, and I didn't have those interactions to be able to say, oh, Chris is paging me. I need to race to this room because if she's saying something's wrong, she's been here for 25 years, something's really wrong, right? So you're talking about the breakdown of trust not from anybody doing anything wrong, but from the pure standpoint of I don't have people next to me that I know. And this goes into cognitive trust. So I don't know if these people are capable. That's one piece of cognitive trust. And I don't know if these people are consistent, which is the other piece of cognitive trust. And then the other thing that I think we lose when we don't know the humans around us is we lose affective trust too. And affective trust is, do you care about me, right? Do we know each other enough to care about each other? And can I trust you to be truthful and honest with me? Can I trust that the words that you say, that you mean what you say, and that you're not going to go behind my back to management or to a supervisor and say something about what just happened between the two of us? And so there's not just the breakdown of trust between leadership and the people at the bedside, but there's also this breakdown of trust of people are getting burned out and leaving, and then the people who are left behind, there aren't those strong cohesive bonds that are formed by trust.
So how do we get out of this? I mean, I think that's the thing, like I think that's the place where all of our healthcare providers listening are like, yes, you've nailed the problems. There are many. What do we do now?
So I think that it starts in a couple of places. Number one is this. Part of what we're doing at the Institute, and we even have a healthcare provider one-day training coming up where we really want to equip people with what they need in order to be able to be more regulated and stay in their jobs at the bedside, is we really do need more humans that are clinicians learning how to get regulated. It starts with us, right? It is a systemic issue, and we are going to change the system. And also the way that we change the system is one human at a time, learning how to show up differently, right? So it gets to be a bottom-up process and a top-down process, right? I think for me, it was, I need to take care of myself. I need to really get in a place where I am more regulated, where I have what I need, because if I end up having a stroke or getting sick myself, we have a connective tissue disorder that's genetic. And so like if I dislocate my hip while I'm working too much because I've walked too many miles during my shift, I'm not helpful to anybody. So really it is putting that oxygen mask on first, which I know we talk about so often, and it's very like, I feel like we talk about it, but again, it's one of those things that's said and not meant. And I really mean it. Like we have to say, no, I'm not working that overtime shift. We have to say, no, I'm actually going to stop and take a lunch break because that's legally required. You know, we have to do those things. And we're going to talk more about this in another episode on self-care. So.
Yeah, I feel like too, it's a radical shift, right? I mean, people listening, what we're describing feels really radical when you've been stuck inside those systems, you know, for so long, from whether you're a leader, whether you're at the bedside or you're someone in between. And at the same time, we're also in systems that we know from evidence that are built more on being a sick system, right? Even for our patients. And so what we're really proposing in the work that we do, you know, and you as the visionary, Dr. Lee, is we're really putting out there into the world, like, we want to be preventative with this. We want to help healthcare providers understand themselves better, so then they can show up to work in a different way. They can help educate their peers. You know, it's almost like being like this ray of light in a sense when you go to work each day, knowing that you're super empowered to step into that role for yourself at the end of the day.
That empowerment piece is huge.
Something that's been really key for me is detaching my identity from my job. So many healthcare providers, I think, become the role of their job, and then their job takes the forefront of their life. Like, this is who I am and this is what I do. And I think it's worth having a heart to heart with yourself and asking yourself, you know, is this who I am? Is this the only thing that I do? Could I do other things? What do I want to do? Not necessarily going out and starting a new career, but, you know, do I want to learn to ride a skateboard? You know, whatever you want to do. Allowing yourself to be an entire person, both at and away from your workplace.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Like, where can you infuse joy, right, in your day-to-day life? So if it is like, I've always wanted to ride a skateboard or haven't done it in a long time. So how do you do that on your off day, right? Like how, instead, because so many of us, like we carry the burden of what's going on in the healthcare system and with our patients on our off days. I mean, I remember having dreams about certain little patients that I was taking care of, and it was my off day, and I would still be thinking about them and like almost couldn't wait to get back to work, right, to check on them. So how do we disconnect in a healthy way? So I love that you bring up things like that, like who am I, right, when I'm not at work? Who else am I?
And that's all really just boundaries, right? Like we have to be able to create boundaries around our work lives so that our work lives don't become our whole lives. And we also need to create boundaries for our independent lives so that we're not bringing home the sometimes horrible things that we see at work and letting that leak into stress for our children or our spouses or our family members. And I think that's a place where, one thing we haven't really talked about is privacy and patient privacy. Patient privacy is so important, and it also creates this gap where providers don't have anywhere safe that they can outlet their feelings about what is happening to the people that they're taking care of. And so I think finding a way to discharge that emotion safely and in a way that protects your patient's privacy so that you're not having to bring it home with you every day, because you're right, your brain will keep thinking about it, keep working on it all the time. And whether you realize it or not, you're still working all the time.
I think what you're saying about the discharge is so important here. So one of the things we talk about in recovery from trauma, releasing trauma, healing trauma, whatever term you want to use here, is how we move it through our bodies. And in today's current healthcare system, there's really barely any organized way of discharging the awful things and the hard things that we go through on a daily basis. And so this is something that I think is a great idea. If we have anyone listening here for like D&P projects or for research, this, or just anyone can do this. Anyone can start this. You don't have to be a doctorally prepared nurse or it doesn't matter what your degree is. Like any healthcare provider can start this at their work. Is creating more of that trust in that community, and also allowing for these moments of vulnerability, allowing for these moments of processing. I remember when at our hospital they said that they were going to implement debriefs after codes. And one of the key places that I think that is missing, that is a prime opportunity, is after like rapid responses or after what we called ERTs, emergency responses, because they're not quite codes, right? Nobody has actively died or tried to die. And they are very dangerous and they are scary and they feel threatening. And I remember after ERTs or the rapid responses, we would just go straight back to work. And there was no, I'm going to go in the bathroom and like shake out my hands and cry, or all of us who were just involved in that ERT, the patient has left that room. Like, let's take a minute here and just do some deep breaths and like let out some sound. And all of these things sound, if you had told me 5 years ago that we were going to do this, I would have been like, wow, that sounds really woo woo, or like out there. Is there any scientific research for this? But there's so much proof. There's so much science in, if we, in the moment of threat, let those chemicals and let that energy and that emotion move and discharge out of our body, that we then don't take that home with us, or at least not to the level we do right now.
One of the things that I'm most proud of from my teaching time at the college was I had the opportunity to design the layout template for where our students would document the patients that they saw during their clinical days. And we added a reflection box to that so that they could just jot down questions or things they didn't feel comfortable with or had, just thought about during the day. And it was a place where they could communicate with the faculty. But we found that students were just using it to just say, like, this patient was wild. I would have never have thought I would like, they were really just commenting on the experience of being with that person. And I feel like that is such a healthy thing that we don't actually have a place to do in our real life clinical practice. I would love to see a way for emotional processing to come into our daily process of working with patients.
Absolutely. So if anyone here is listening and you're in education and you want somebody to come in and teach you how to emotionally process, teach your students how to emotionally process, honestly, I think that this is the number one. We talk about resiliency. This is the number one resiliency skill, is being able to process through whatever dysregulating stuff happens. So, okay, we could keep talking about this forever. We have an upcoming episode on trauma-informed self-care that if the self-care piece of this intrigued you, please stay tuned for that. Make sure that you subscribe to the podcast so that you get notified when that episode comes out. And we want to formally invite you to our upcoming Trauma-Informed Healthcare Provider one-day training. It is at the end of September. If you're listening to this after September 2022, no worries. It's going to be recorded. It will be up as a self-study course. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, learning more about emotional processing, learning more about how to infuse trauma-informed practices into your clinical practice, or maybe you've already left the bedside and there is something that you'd like to learn, or you'd still like to learn this for yourselves, then we really want to invite you to come in, and feel free to bring team or colleagues or students or whomever feels best. So we will catch you next episode. Thank you again, Dr. Lindsey, Dr. Nicole, for coming on here. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
See you next week. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Invitation to head to our show notes to check out the offers and connections we mentioned. Or you can just head straight over to institutefortrauma.com and hop in our email list so that you never miss any of the cool things that we're doing over at the Institute. Invitation to be well and to take care of yourself this week, and we'll see you next time.